I knew something was wrong the moment my son whispered, "Don't tell the neighbors. You're my mother." He said it quickly, barely moving his lips, as if he were afraid someone might overhear, like I was a secret, a blemish on the image he had carefully constructed. It wasn't the first time I had been told to hide in plain sight, to shrink away into something unnoticed. But this time, the coldness in his voice stung in a way I couldn't ignore. I didn't ask him why he had said it. I didn't ask anything at all. I just nodded, my lips curling into what I hoped was a smile, though it probably looked more like a grimace. The man watering his lawn across the street seemed oblivious to the moment. He nodded back, polite, distant. I waved, like I was supposed to, like I was some kind of guest in his perfect little world. The last few months had been a blur of trips, doctor's visits, and quiet conversations that always seemed to end with me being gently pushed aside. They had moved into the big house with the freshly painted walls and a white picket fence, a house that had cost them more than they could afford. And they had needed my help. I had given it, of course, as I always did. My savings had helped with the down payment. My time, my energy, my advice. They all went into that house. I thought I was building something for them, something that would hold us together, the way families are supposed to be. I thought I was important to them, that my presence in their lives meant something. But lately, it felt like I had become nothing more than a footnote in their story, an obligation they had to manage, like a piece of furniture to be dusted off when convenient and tucked away when it wasn't. When I arrived at their house for what I thought was going to be a quiet visit, I had no idea that it would be the last time I would ever feel like I was a part of something real. The guest room they had prepared for me was cold and sterile, the bed neatly made, the furniture minimal. It could have been a hotel room, or worse, a waiting room, a place to sleep, but not to live. The walls were bare, no photos, no personal touches. It was a room designed for someone who wasn't expected to stay long, someone whose existence was just a temporary inconvenience. But I had always been patient, always made myself small enough to fit in the cracks, to not disturb their routines. I had come here after a long journey. The flight from Oregon to Connecticut had been uncomfortable, the seats too small, the air too dry, my knees aching from the hours spent in one position. It wasn't the first time I had traveled across the country to visit them, but something about this time felt different. Something in my bones told me that this visit would be the one where I would finally see the truth. And I did. The house was beautiful, perfectly decorated with modern furniture and clean lines, but it didn't feel like home. It felt like a stage, a show where I was the supporting character, there to make everything look nice for the audience. When Daniel, my son, led me to the guest room, he didn't meet my eyes. There was no warmth in his voice, no welcome. He spoke quickly, telling me about the schedule for the weekend, about the social event they had planned, the farmer's market, the park, the kids. He never once asked me how I was feeling or if I needed anything. I stood there, in that sterile guest room, my suitcase still unopened, and I realized something that I had been trying to ignore for years. They didn't need me anymore. They didn't want me anymore, and that truth hurt more than I could put into words. I thought about all the years I had spent raising him, taking care of him, giving up my own dreams and desires to make sure he had what he needed. I thought about the sacrifices I had made, the things I had put aside for the sake of my family. I had given everything to him, to them, and yet, here I was, alone in a guest room, a guest in my own son's life, reduced to nothing more than a helper, a source of funds, a shadow that followed them around, never quite visible, never quite important. And then, when I walked into the kitchen that morning, it hit me with a force that almost knocked me off my feet. The fridge was stocked with organic vegetables, gluten-free snacks, and fancy protein shakes. Everything was carefully curated, labeled with labels that had no meaning to me. There were no jars of homemade jam, no leftovers from last night's dinner, no signs that anyone in this house had ever known the comfort of a home-cooked meal. The kitchen felt cold, impersonal, like everything in it was designed to look perfect, but nothing was meant to be used, to be enjoyed. And that's when I realized this wasn't my home anymore. This was a place where I no longer belonged. As I stood there, making coffee in the sleek, modern machine that seemed more like a spaceship than an appliance, I felt a sharp pang of loss. This wasn't the home I had imagined. This wasn't the family I had hoped for. And yet, I stayed silent. I didn't complain. I never do. I knew the drill. I knew how to be invisible, how to fade into the background and not cause any trouble. But in that moment, I realized that I had lost more than just my place in their lives. I had lost my own sense of self, my own identity, to a role that they had assigned me. I wasn't a mother anymore. I wasn't a grandmother. I was just a guest, a convenient option when they needed something. Later that day, after they had all left for their various outings, I sat in the guest room, staring at the empty walls, and I wondered if I could ever find my way back to a life that felt like my own. Could I ever reclaim the person I used to be? Could I ever find a way to stop being invisible? I didn't know the answer. But I did know one thing for sure. I wasn't going to sit here and wait for them to decide who I was anymore. I wasn't going to be their forgotten piece of furniture anymore. If I was going to find myself again, I was going to have to do it on my own. And so, that night, after dinner, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let them control me anymore. I wasn't going to wait for their approval, their validation. I wasn't going to be the mother who waited in the background, forgotten and silent. I was going to take control of my life again. It wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be quick. But it was going to be mine. It wasn't until the next morning, when I was already finishing my coffee in the cold kitchen, that I finally felt it. I had been trying to push the thought away, to pretend like it wasn't true, but it kept creeping back in, gnawing at me, making my skin crawl with discomfort. It was that tiny, insistent voice in the back of my head that reminded me how everything had shifted. I wasn't being welcomed here. I wasn't part of this family anymore. I was just an outsider, a visitor in my own son's life. But I didn't have to hear that voice to know the truth, because the truth was sitting in front of me on the kitchen table, a carefully folded piece of paper, a flight itinerary. It had been there all along, of course. I just hadn't noticed it until now. Daniel had slipped it there the night before, while I was unpacking my bag in the guest room. I hadn't thought much of it at the time. It seemed innocuous enough. Just another piece of paper, another detail of their busy lives that I was supposed to ignore. It wasn't until I read the flight number and destination that the weight of it hit me, like a slap in the face I hadn't seen coming. They were going on a cruise, a family vacation, without me. The words on the paper seemed to blur in front of my eyes as I stared at it, my mind reeling, struggling to comprehend what it meant. Family vacation. There was a time when I would have been the first one to help plan such a trip. There was a time when I would have been the one sitting next to my son, suggesting which excursions to book, choosing where we would eat dinner. There was a time when I was the one who knew everything, who had the answers, who kept the rhythm of our lives in perfect sync. But now, I wasn't even considered part of the equation. I wasn't part of the vacation. I wasn't part of their family's plans. I tried to swallow the lump in my throat, but it stuck there. I thought of all the times I had been there for them, the babysitting, the carpooling, The holiday meals I had prepared year after year. I thought of how I had dropped everything to help them with their needs, how I had opened my house and my heart to them when they needed a place to stay, a shoulder to lean on, a listening ear. And yet, here I was, left behind. "Just stay home and take care of the kids," they had said. "It'll be nice. You'll have plenty of time to rest." Rest. What a laughable suggestion. As if I hadn't been exhausted by years of giving and giving, of caring for everyone else while my own needs were ignored, swept aside like crumbs under a rug. And then it hit me. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an oversight. This wasn't a situation where they had simply forgotten to include me. No, this was deliberate. This was intentional. They had made a decision, without telling me, without even asking for my opinion, that I would be left behind, that I would be the one to stay home and watch the kids, to be the ever-present, ever-helpful grandmother who was always there when needed, but never really part of their lives anymore. I wasn't even a guest. I was just a convenience, a person who could be used when they wanted, discarded when they didn't. I felt my breath catch in my throat, the shock of it cutting deeper than I expected. It wasn't the first time I had been dismissed, of course. Over the years, I had learned to accept the subtle ways in which my presence had been marginalized, the quiet ways in which I had been pushed out of the picture. But this was different. This wasn't a slow fade into the background. This wasn't the gradual erosion of my role in their lives. This was an outright rejection, a final decision that I was no longer needed, no longer wanted. And as I sat there, staring at the flight itinerary, I couldn't help but feel something snap inside me. A thread that had been holding me together for so long broke. A part of me that had always been the mother, the helper, the caregiver, the one who never complained, the one who always did what was asked without question, shattered into pieces. And with that break came a rush of clarity, a sudden, painful understanding of what I had allowed to happen. I had allowed myself to become invisible. I had allowed them to take my love, my time, my energy, and turn it into something they could use when it was convenient for them. I had given everything to them, and they had taken it all without ever once thinking about what it was costing me. And now they were taking one more thing, my dignity. I stood up from the table, the paper still clutched in my hand, and walked slowly to the window. I could see the street outside, the houses lined up like perfect little boxes in their manicured neighborhood, the families rushing to their cars, to their appointments, to their perfect, well-ordered lives. I watched as the sun rose higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the pavement, and I felt something stir inside me, something I hadn't felt in years. It was a small, quiet spark, barely a whisper, but it was there. The beginning of something. The beginning of my decision to stop being their invisible, silent servant. The beginning of my decision to finally choose myself, to stop waiting for permission to live. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do next, but I knew I couldn't stay. I couldn't stay in this house, in this life, where I was nothing more than an accessory, an afterthought. I couldn't stay in a place where my worth was measured by how useful I could be, how quiet I could be, how invisible I could be. It wasn't enough. I wasn't enough. And the worst part of it all was that I had let it happen. I had let them make me feel small, unimportant, unnecessary. I had let them forget me. But not anymore. Not today. I folded the flight itinerary carefully, then stuffed it into my purse. The house felt colder now, emptier. The walls seemed to close in around me as I stood there, my hand resting on the kitchen counter, my mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. I needed to get out. I needed to breathe. I needed to be somewhere where I wasn't just a role to be played, a character to be forgotten. So, I made my decision. I was going to leave. I didn't know where I was going, but I was going. The small, quiet part of me that had been dormant for so long had finally awakened, and it was telling me to walk away, to take control of my life again. I wasn't going to be forgotten anymore. I wasn't going to be the one left behind. I wasn't going to wait for them to remember me. I was going to choose myself. The days that followed were filled with a silence that settled over me like a heavy, suffocating blanket. I had packed my bag, left the house as quietly as I had come in, and headed to the nearest bus station. The decision to leave had been impulsive, but the feeling that had led me to it was something I couldn't ignore anymore. There was a part of me, a part I hadn't fully recognized until that moment, that simply wanted to run. Run far away from the house, from the family, from everything that had made me feel small, unnecessary, invisible. I needed to breathe in air that wasn't filtered through their expectations, their assumptions, their quiet dismissals. I needed to remember what it felt like to be myself, to make a decision based on my own desires, not out of obligation or guilt. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't need to. I just knew I couldn't stay there, pretending that everything was fine, pretending that I wasn't being erased from their lives. So I bought a one-way ticket to a place I hadn't been in years, Portland. It wasn't much, just a name that lingered in my memory, a city I had once loved, once belonged to before everything had changed. It felt like a world away from the quiet, controlled environment of my son's house, where my presence had become an inconvenience, where every corner of my existence seemed to be monitored and managed. I was done with that, done with being a prop in their well-constructed lives. I sat on the bus, staring out the window, my mind drifting between thoughts of what I had left behind and what I might find ahead. The city I had once known had probably changed, just as I had. People grow older, memories fade, and places evolve. But I didn't care about what it had become. I cared about the freedom it represented, the possibility of being somewhere that didn't hold me to a version of myself that wasn't real anymore, somewhere I could breathe and decide for myself who I was, what I wanted, and how I would live. Portland was rainy, as I remembered, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and old buildings. I walked through the streets, past cafes and bookstores, not really looking for anything, but just letting myself wander, letting myself be absorbed by the atmosphere. It was different now. I was different now. I wasn't the woman I had been before, the one who had cooked family dinners and hosted holiday gatherings, the one who had poured her heart and soul into raising her son, making sure he had everything he needed, making sure he never felt alone. I wasn't that woman anymore, and maybe I never would be again. But that wasn't the point anymore. I wasn't trying to find myself in the past. I was trying to find a version of myself that still had meaning, that still mattered, even if only to me. I wandered through the streets for hours, not knowing where I was going, but somehow trusting that I would end up where I needed to be. I passed a small bookstore and went inside, breathing in the familiar smell of paper and ink. I ran my fingers along the spines of the books, letting myself get lost in the rows, in the quiet space where no one was judging me, no one was expecting anything from me. For the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't have to be anything for anyone. I didn't have to make excuses for who I was or why I was there. I was just there. When the sun began to set, I decided to find somewhere to stay for the night. I didn't have much money, but I knew I could make do. I found a small motel on the edge of the city, a place that looked like it hadn't changed in decades. It was quiet, worn around the edges, but it felt like home in a way I hadn't felt in years. I checked in, paid for the night with the small amount of cash I had, and went up to my room. It was small, the bed soft, but not luxurious, the carpet old and stained in places. But it didn't matter. It was mine, at least for tonight. That night, as I lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, I thought about my son and his family. I thought about the house I had helped them build, the house that was supposed to be the foundation of their lives. I thought about the things they had said to me, the things they hadn't said. And I realized something. I wasn't just left behind because of the cruise. I wasn't left behind because I had become a burden. I was left behind because I had allowed them to make me feel like I was nothing more than an accessory to their perfect lives. I had allowed them to decide that I didn't matter, that I wasn't needed, and in doing so, I had made myself invisible, a shadow in the background, someone who was always there but never truly seen. But that was over now. I wasn't going to be invisible anymore. I wasn't going to wait for them to decide when it was my turn to exist, when it was my turn to be part of their lives. I wasn't going to wait for them to see me, to remember that I was a person with needs and desires, a person who mattered just as much as anyone else. I wasn't going to keep sacrificing myself for them, for a life that didn't belong to me. I was done with being invisible. I was done with waiting. The next day, I found a small room to rent in a house on the outskirts of the city. The woman who owned it, Joyce, was gruff but kind. She didn't ask questions, didn't try to make me feel like I needed to explain myself. She just handed me a key and showed me to the room. It wasn't much, just a small space with a bed and a desk, but it was mine. I paid her in cash, and that was the beginning of my new life, a life where I wasn't someone's responsibility, where I wasn't a burden. I wasn't sure what I was going to do next, but I knew this. I was no longer going to be controlled by anyone else's expectations. I was going to find a way to live for myself. The first few days were hard. I didn't know anyone in Portland, and everything felt unfamiliar. But it was also freeing in a way I hadn't expected. I walked through the streets, letting myself explore without a destination, without a plan. I didn't have to be anywhere or do anything. I could just be. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. I started to look for work, small jobs here and there to make a living. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. I didn't need much. I just needed enough to survive, enough to feel like I was building something for myself, not for anyone else. It was hard at first, but I was determined. I wasn't going to give up. I wasn't going to let myself be erased again. The more I worked, the more I realized something important. I wasn't just surviving. I was living. For the first time in years, I was making decisions that were mine and mine alone. I wasn't waiting for anyone's approval. I wasn't waiting for anyone to tell me that I mattered. I knew now that I mattered, whether they saw it or not. And that was enough. It began with something as small as a folded newspaper. I had been living in Joyce's upstairs room for nearly 2 weeks by then, and each morning I would come down quietly, boil water for instant coffee, and sit by the window where the sun filtered through lace curtains like a memory trying to come back. I didn't expect much from the world. I didn't expect warmth or acknowledgement or even a good morning. I expected silence, maybe an occasional nod from Joyce, who shuffled around in her slippers, watering her plants and talking more to her cat than to me. And I was fine with that. The quiet, the emptiness. It all felt like something I could control, unlike the house I had fled, or the people who filled it with their polished shoes and curated lives. But that morning, there was a newspaper on the counter. Not just any paper. but the city's free local, thin, grey, slightly damp at the edges from dew or neglect. Joyce had picked it up from somewhere and tossed it onto the table next to my coffee mug without a word. At first I ignored it. I wasn't interested in the world outside, not the politics, not the events, not the weather. But then I saw something on the back page, a job listing for a small diner 2 blocks from the house. Morning shift. Apply in person. Experience welcome, but not required. I stared at those words for a long time. My hands trembled slightly, not with fear, but with something more dangerous. Hope. It had been over 15 years since I last worked. My knees weren't what they used to be. My back had a slow complaint about every movement, but something inside me said, try. It took me 20 minutes to walk the 2 blocks. The diner was nothing special. A low, squat building with cracked paint on the trim and a crooked sign that read, Sarah's Place, in peeling red letters. Inside it smelled of coffee grounds and floor cleaner, bacon grease and burnt toast. It smelled like work, like mornings, like something familiar. The girl behind the counter looked about 20, her hair piled into a bun that kept unraveling. She didn't blink when I said I wanted to apply. Just called to the back. A woman emerged, heavy-set, no nonsense, apron dusted with flour. Her name was Heather. She squinted at me like she wasn't sure I was serious. You got restaurant experience? No, I said. But I raised 3 kids. I know how to wake up early, make coffee, clean a mess, and keep people fed, even when they don't say thank you. She let that sit for a second. Then she nodded. Trial shift tomorrow, 6 to 11. You make it through that. We'll talk. That night, I couldn't sleep. I laid out the only blouse I owned that still held a crease, brushed my hair back into a neat knot, and set my alarm for 5 a.m. sharp. I woke before it rang. The city was still dark when I stepped outside, my breath clouding in the air. I walked the now familiar path in silence, hands tucked deep into my coat pockets. And when I arrived, I didn't hesitate. I tied on the apron Heather handed me and got to work. It was harder than I remembered, taking orders, pouring coffee without spilling, keeping track of table numbers, learning the rhythms of the regulars. My feet throbbed by 9, my back complained by 10, but something else kept me upright. Pride. Not arrogance, not vanity. Pride in the work, in the motion, in the fact that I was standing there doing something that was mine, not because someone needed me to, not because anyone asked, because I chose it. Heather didn't say much, but at the end of the shift, she nodded once, like a general acknowledging a soldier. Come back tomorrow, she said. You did fine. You'll get better. She poured herself a coffee and added, It's minimum wage, plus tips. You want it, it's yours. I wanted it. The paycheck was small, laughably small, but when she handed me that envelope, thin, creased, barely heavier than air, I felt a rush of something like joy. It was the first money I'd earned for myself in over a decade. No one had told me to get it. No one would spend it but me. I walked straight to the little second-hand shop I'd passed a dozen times and found a navy wool coat with deep pockets and a faded herringbone pattern. It wasn't new. It didn't need to be. It was sturdy, warm, and mine. The girl at the counter wrapped it in tissue paper like it was a gift. You look sharp, she said. I smiled and replied, I feel sharp. That night, I wore the coat home, just cold enough to justify it. Joyce was on the porch with Franklin, the cat curled around her ankles. Look at you, she said. Classy lady. I didn't tell her where I'd been, what I'd done. I just smiled and went inside. I sat on the edge of my bed, running my fingers along the fabric. It wasn't just a coat, it was a beginning. A small, quiet declaration. I'm still here. I still get to choose. The next morning, I returned to work. Heather barked orders. I followed them. The regulars began to remember my name. One of them, Arthur, a man in a grey windbreaker with a voice like gravel and a gaze like spring water, started coming in every day at the same time. He didn't flirt. He didn't ask questions. He just drank his coffee slowly and tipped well. We talked about birds, cardinals, finches, even crows. I hadn't spoken about birds in years. I hadn't spoken about anything that wasn't a task or a favour in years. By the end of the week, I could carry 4 plates without spilling. I could clear a 4-top in under 2 minutes. I knew who liked their toast burnt and who wanted their coffee black as motor oil. I was part of something. Not a family, not a legacy, a rhythm, a function. A role that wasn't given to me out of pity or necessity, but one I had claimed. When I got my second paycheck, I walked to the bank and cashed it myself. The teller, a girl with chipped purple nails and a suspicious squint, asked me how I wanted the bills. 10s and 5s, I said. 1s for the rest. She handed them over, and I folded them into my wallet like they were treasure. Then I bought myself a new pair of wool socks and a crossword book. It wasn't much. It didn't have to be. Because somewhere between the first pot of burnt diner coffee and the last folded napkin of the shift, something inside me had turned. I no longer thought about whether they missed me, whether they wondered where I'd gone, whether they regretted what they had done. I didn't check my phone. I didn't read their emails. If there were any, I didn't care. I wasn't angry anymore. I was rebuilding, not what I had lost. Something new. It had been nearly a month since I left, and I started to realize that this wasn't just a new chapter. This was a whole different world, one where I no longer waited for someone to come after me or for someone to remind me that I mattered. I was waking up every morning with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. I worked harder now than I had before. Every morning feeling like I had a job, like I wasn't just waiting around or merely existing. I wasn't a stranger in someone else's house anymore, quietly in the background, doing what I was told. I was part of something. Not important, not irreplaceable, but still a part of something. And for the first time in years, that was enough. I learned to appreciate the silence in Joyce's home, to respect the space I took up there, and not to ask for more. It was enough for me to feel like I was living again, instead of just existing. But everything changed the day I walked into the cafe and saw them. At first, I didn't recognize them. But then, as the 2 figures standing in the doorway looked at me, it hit me. It was them, my son and Carla. I couldn't believe my eyes. I hadn't expected them to show up here, not after everything that had happened. They stood in the doorway, and in that moment, something familiar and old washed over me. I didn't belong here. This was their space, their world, their rules. I felt like I was thrust back into the old version of myself, the version that didn't matter, the version that couldn't ask questions or challenge anything. I stood in the cafe, trying to remain unnoticed, trying not to disturb the illusion of their perfect life, but something inside me stirred, like a pot left unattended too long. They turned, and I instantly knew. This wasn't a random visit. They knew I was here. It took no more than a second for Carla, with her fake smile, to move toward me. "Martha," she said, her voice sweet but with an undertone that felt rehearsed. "We thought you had left. We didn't know what happened, but we were worried. We've been thinking about you." The words left her lips without conviction, mechanical and empty. She paused, her eyes avoiding mine, but there was something in them I couldn't ignore. For a moment, I felt a wave of relief. She wasn't lying outright. She was pretending. But I could see right through it. I put down my coffee and slowly got up to face them. As I walked over to them, I could feel the tension in my chest. But I took a deep breath, pushing all the noise out of my mind. I knew what I had to say. I wouldn't back down. Not now. Not ever again. "No, I didn't leave, Carla. I just don't want to be part of this life anymore. I don't want to be part of a life where I'm forgotten, where I'm just background noise, easily removed when it's convenient." Carla mumbled something inaudible, as if she didn't understand. But it wasn't about understanding. It was about control. My son stood next to her, like a puppet whose strings were pulled by someone else. He didn't look at me. He didn't even meet my gaze. He just looked away, his face flushed with guilt. But he wouldn't acknowledge it. I could see it in his eyes. He didn't want to talk about this. Not yet. Maybe never. "We thought you were just visiting your sister. Or some old friends. We didn't know what was happening with you, but we've been concerned." His voice was flat, rehearsed. He didn't say, "I miss you," or "I'm sorry." He said the words that he thought I needed to hear to make everything go back to normal. But it wasn't normal anymore. It hadn't been normal for years. I had stopped being important to him the day he walked out of that door and left me to wait for him in an airport lounge. A thing of no value, easily forgotten. "No, Adam," I said, my voice steady, calm. "I understand what you want to say, but I'm not here for your apology. I'm not interested in playing that role anymore. The one where I sit silently, waiting for your approval, for your validation. I'm not your obligation, not your convenience, not your afterthought anymore. I'm done with that. I've been done for a long time." He flinched at my words, but I didn't care. His discomfort didn't matter to me anymore. I wasn't here to spare him from his guilt. I wasn't here to make him feel better about abandoning me. I was here to reclaim the last bit of dignity I had left. They had erased me from their lives, and now I was returning to mine. Not because they wanted me back, but because I had learned to want something better. I didn't wait for them to respond. I turned and left the cafe, my heart pounding in my chest, but also feeling lighter. There were no more words left to say. The damage had been done, and now it was time for me to move forward. The next day, when I showed up for my shift, I was confronted by something I hadn't expected. Their lawyer. The man in the suit walked into the cafe as if it were a business meeting, like he had all the time in the world. He didn't seem surprised to see me working. He probably knew I was working. He knew exactly where I was. He came up to me, and with that cold, impersonal tone, he said, "We need you to return home. Adam and Lisa are worried. They just want to make sure you're safe." For a moment, I stared at him, letting the words sink in. I could feel the contempt rising in me, the anger that had been buried for so long, and I didn't hide it. I didn't feel sorry for them. I didn't feel guilty. All I felt was disgust at their arrogance, at their audacity. How dare they? How dare they send a man like this to try to convince me that I didn't have the right to make my own decisions, that I wasn't allowed to be in charge of my own life? "I am safe, and I don't need your approval to live my life," I replied coldly, my voice steady. He blinked, clearly unprepared for my response. I didn't wait for him to say anything else. I turned away from him, walked back to the counter, and resumed my work. No one in the cafe seemed to notice the tension, or if they did, they didn't comment on it. They didn't have to. I had made my decision. I was no longer waiting for their permission. I was no longer waiting for them to see me, to recognize me. I wasn't going back. As the days passed, the attempts continued. Another letter arrived from Adam. This time it was formal, legal, and full of his carefully crafted words. He wanted me to return. He wanted me to reconsider. He talked about how disruptive it was for the family to not know where I was, to not hear from me. He made it seem as though they were the ones who had been hurt, the ones who had suffered. As if my absence was a betrayal. But it was all a performance. They had never cared about me, not really. They cared about appearances. They cared about control. I didn't respond. I didn't have to. One evening, while I was closing up at the cafe, I saw a familiar face through the window. Kieran, my grandson. He was standing there, looking uncertain. His hands were in his pockets, and he was staring into the cafe like he wasn't sure whether he should come in. For a moment, I just stood there, watching him, feeling the quiet ache in my chest. He was the only one who had ever truly seen me, who had ever cared. He wasn't here to try to force me back into their world. He wasn't here to judge me. He was just here to check on me, to make sure I was okay. When I opened the door, he smiled shyly, and I didn't have to ask him anything. I didn't need to know what Adam had told him, what Lisa had said. I knew Kieran. I knew his heart. He wasn't part of their game. I've been worried about you, Grandma, he said softly, stepping inside. I'm fine, I replied, my voice steady, and this time I meant it. Because for the first time in a long time, I was. The tension had been building for weeks, each day a subtle shift, a quiet collision between what they wanted and what I needed. Every letter, every phone call, every visit had been a reminder of what I was trying to escape. Their control, their expectations, their suffocating grip on my life. I knew they were coming for me. They had to be. But for once, I didn't feel afraid. I didn't feel the usual dread creeping into my bones, the fear of being trapped again. This time, I was ready. It wasn't a confrontation, not exactly. It didn't have the flair of some dramatic showdown. There were no raised voices, no tears or desperate pleas for forgiveness. The scene that played out in front of me, in the small cafe where I had worked so hard to rebuild myself, was quieter, sharper, more definitive. They came in together, Adam and Carla, just like they always did, united, side by side, as if the world was theirs to control. I was behind the counter, cleaning the coffee machine, wiping down the counters, lost in the rhythm of the work. I didn't see them at first, not until Adam cleared his throat, loudly enough to cut through the hum of the cafe. When I turned around, I saw them standing by the door, their eyes locked on me. They didn't move, didn't even step inside, as if waiting for me to come to them, to acknowledge their presence like I had done so many times before. I felt the old pang of recognition, the same sense of familiarity that had always come with their visits, the weight of their expectations. But this time was different. I didn't feel the need to shrink, to apologize, to make myself small for their comfort. I stood up straighter, my shoulders back, my gaze steady. I was done with being small, with being invisible. I wasn't going to beg for their approval anymore. Adam's voice was low, measured. He looked at me with that same sense of ownership, as if I were still that version of myself that could be molded to fit into his life, into their life. "Mom," he said, his tone laced with a mix of frustration and something else I couldn't quite place. "We need to talk. You can't just disappear like this. It's not healthy. It's not right." I looked at him. There was a time when those words, those demands, would have sliced through me. There was a time when I would have felt guilty, felt like I had to explain myself, to justify my choices. But not anymore. The old Martha was gone, the one who thought her worth was tied to their approval. I had left her behind when I walked out of their house, when I chose to take control of my life, to stop letting them define me. "You don't get to tell me what's healthy for me anymore, Adam," I said quietly. "You don't get to decide what's right for me. I'm not your responsibility. I'm not your problem. I'm not here for your approval. I'm here because I choose to be." He flinched, his expression faltering for a brief moment. But it was Carla who stepped forward then, her voice sharp, cutting through the tension between us. "This isn't about approval, Martha. This is about family. We're trying to help you. You can't keep running away from us. You can't just isolate yourself like this. It's selfish." I felt the words land, but they didn't stick. It was like they were talking at me, not to me. They didn't hear what I was saying. They couldn't understand what I had found, the peace that had settled over me since I left. This wasn't about them. It wasn't about what they wanted or needed. It was about me, about my right to exist outside of their expectations, to live on my own terms. "You don't understand," I said, the words coming more forcefully now, as if breaking through a dam that had held back years of resentment. "This is my life, not yours. You don't get to decide when it's over, or when I'm allowed to be happy. I'm not a child anymore, Adam. I'm not the person you can manipulate into doing what you want. I'm not that woman." His eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched. For a second, I saw the anger flicker there, the same anger that had simmered for years, always just beneath the surface. But then, as quickly as it came, it was gone, replaced by a kind of resignation. He wasn't fighting anymore. He was tired. Tired of fighting me. Tired of trying to force me back into their mold. And in that moment, I realized something. I wasn't fighting him anymore either. I wasn't fighting anyone. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I had nothing to prove. Carla opened her mouth to say something, but I held up my hand, stopping her. I didn't need to hear any more. I had heard it all before. The pity, the guilt trips, the half-hearted offers of help. I didn't want it anymore. I didn't need it. "You should go," I said, my voice calm but firm. "I'm not coming back. Not to your house. Not to your life. I've moved on. And I'm done with you trying to make me feel like I don't have the right to move on." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Adam looked at me, his eyes softening for the briefest second, and then he nodded, like he had finally accepted something he hadn't wanted to face. Carla didn't nod. She didn't look at me at all. She just turned and walked out, her heels clicking sharply against the tile floor. Adam lingered for a moment longer, and then, without a word, he followed her. I stood there for a long time, just staring at the door they had left through. I felt the weight of their absence, the finality of it, and I knew, deep in my bones, that this was the end of something. Not the end of my story, but the end of theirs in mine. I wasn't going to wait for them to fix me anymore. I wasn't going to let them control my future, my choices. They had done enough damage, and it had taken me this long to realize that I didn't need them to survive. I didn't need them to be whole. I looked around the cafe, at the familiar faces of the regulars, the smell of coffee in the air, the hum of quiet conversations, and the clink of silverware. This was my life now. It was small, perhaps. It wasn't glamorous or full of the grand gestures they expected, but it was mine. And for the first time in years, I was at peace with it. That night, after I closed up the cafe and locked the door behind me, I walked down the quiet street, the cool night air brushing against my skin, and I smiled. It wasn't a smile of triumph or victory. It was a smile of quiet, deep relief. I had reclaimed my life, not from them, but from the person I had allowed myself to become. I was free to make my own decisions, to be my own person, to choose my own path. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had finally found home. Not in the house I once lived in, not in the place they had tried to create for me, but in myself. And that was enough. The days that followed were quieter, but they were not empty. The phone stayed silent. The letters stopped coming. I had expected some sort of finality to it all, some great moment of clarity or release, but there was none. Instead, there was just the steady rhythm of my life, the hum of the small cafe, the familiar faces of the regulars, the conversations that, for once, didn't have any hidden meanings behind them. People were just people now, not roles I had to play or spaces I had to fill. I wasn't the one they pitied anymore. I wasn't the one they expected to bend, to accommodate, to fade into the background. I was simply someone who existed, just like everyone else. I spent my days in a kind of peaceful stillness I hadn't known in years, a stillness that wasn't filled with regret or longing or the empty spaces of an unspoken apology. I didn't have to wonder if I was loved or if I was missed, because I had stopped waiting for those things. I wasn't waiting for anyone to validate me anymore. The validation I had been so desperate for, first from my family, then from everyone else, had never really been mine to find. It wasn't something someone else could give me. It had to come from within, and I finally understood that. It wasn't about what anyone thought of me anymore. It wasn't about being someone's mother or grandmother or wife. It was about being me. And for the first time in a long time, I was content with that. The cafe became my anchor, the place where I could feel the pulse of the world around me, a rhythm that had nothing to do with the rhythms of my past, the ones that had been dictated by others. I learned to appreciate the small moments, the quiet mornings before the first rush of customers, the way the light shifted across the floor in the late afternoon, the soft click of the door when someone walked in. It was simple, but it was mine. I started to look forward to the small things, reading a book in the corner after my shift, taking long walks through the streets of Portland, eating dinner alone at a table set for one, not because I was lonely, but because I was finally comfortable in my own company. Kieran came by a few times. Not often, but often enough for me to know that he hadn't forgotten. I didn't push him to visit, didn't beg him to stay. I didn't have to. He came when he wanted to, and when he did, he brought with him a sense of familiarity that was both comforting and grounding. He wasn't like Adam or Carla. He wasn't trying to fix me. He wasn't trying to make me fit into any version of myself that he had in mind. He simply wanted to be with me, as I was, and that was enough. There was a day, a month or so after the visit from Adam and Carla, when I sat in the cafe after my shift, sipping my coffee, staring out the window at the street outside. It was a rainy day, typical for Portland, and the sound of the rain against the windows was like a gentle rhythm, a lullaby to my mind. I was just sitting there, not thinking about anything in particular, when the door opened and I heard the familiar sound of the bell above it. I didn't look up at first. I had learned not to expect anything. But then I heard a voice, low, soft, with an accent that was unmistakable. I looked up, and there he was, Adam, standing in the doorway, looking uncertain, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his jacket. He hesitated for a moment, and I could see the shift in his expression, the moment when he realized that this wasn't a place where he could simply walk in and expect everything to fall back into place. This wasn't a place where I would bend or accommodate him. This was my place now. I didn't speak at first. I didn't say anything. I simply sat there, watching him, waiting for him to make the first move. He stood there for a moment longer, shifting on his feet, like he was trying to figure out what to say, how to bridge the distance that had grown between us. Then he took a step forward, and another. Finally, he was standing at the counter, a few feet away from me, his gaze steady but unsure. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said, his voice low. "I don't even expect you to care about what I have to say, but I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about what happened, and I don't know how to make it right. I don't even know if I can. But I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry for all of it." It was the first time he had said it, the first time he had acknowledged the hurt, the damage, the absence that had stretched between us for so long. I sat there for a moment, my hands wrapped around my coffee cup, letting his words settle into me, into the spaces that had been hollow for so long. It wasn't what I had expected, but it wasn't what I needed either. The apology was a step, but it wasn't a solution. It wasn't a resolution. I had moved beyond needing it to feel whole. I had already forgiven him, and I had already forgiven myself. But there was something in his words, a quiet recognition that we were both broken in different ways, and that perhaps there was a path forward, not back, but forward. "I don't need you to fix me," I said, my voice steady but calm. "I don't need you to make things right. I've learned to live with it. I've learned to live with what we lost, what we didn't have. But I'm here now, and I don't need to go back to what we were. I'm not who I was then." "I don't think you are either." He nodded, his eyes reflecting something I hadn't seen in them for a long time. Understanding, maybe. Regret, not just for what had happened, but for the fact that he hadn't been able to see me, really see me, until now. And in that moment, as I sat across from him, I realized that I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't resentful. I wasn't sad. I was simply free. Free from the weight of their expectations. Free from the shackles I had put on myself in order to fit into their world. Free from the need for anyone's validation, including his. "I think I'm finally okay," I said, a quiet truth that settled deep in my chest. "And I think you will be too. In time." He looked at me for a moment longer, and then, without another word, he stood up, walking out of the cafe, leaving behind the past that had once consumed us both. I didn't watch him leave. I didn't need to. I had let him go long ago, and for the first time, I felt the peace of knowing that he was finally free to live his own life, just as I was free to live mine. That evening, after the cafe had closed, I walked home slowly, the weight of everything that had happened behind me. I didn't carry it with me anymore. The pain, the guilt, the anger, they were just memories now, faded and distant. I had rebuilt myself, piece by piece, and in doing so, I had finally found the peace I had been searching for all these years. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't the way I had imagined it would be, but it was mine, and that was enough.